Well, hi everyone, Sean Humphreys here. Welcome to All Things Retirement. Well, in this installment, we are going to embark on a few videos. This will be the first in a few on different terms that get thrown around in the financial industry and in the news around economics and government policy. And having an understanding of basic terminology is important because it helps us to make better personal choices in our finances, but also it helps us to be more engaged and educated around policy decisions made by government. And the term we're going to talk about today is fiscal policy. So I know fiscal policy, you want to change the channel, you want to do something different, but just bear with me because fiscal policy is not just something that politicians talk about and economists and portfolio managers, but it has a direct impact on our day-to-day experiences for our families. So you do want to be engaged in understanding fiscal policy, the basic outline, so that when you hear the term talked about, you follow the bouncing ball and maybe even get engaged in the discussion a little bit because it impacts your bottom line. It impacts your pocketbook. It impacts your quality of life, not just for you, but also for your family and for the people around you for generations to come. So let's unpack fiscal policy. Now, before we do that, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We're posting content all the time on different aspects of retirement income planning and overall wealth planning. So hit subscribe if you don't want to miss future content. Well, loosely speaking, fiscal policy is essentially government policy. These are policies that governments pursue to impact the economy while at the same time achieving other important public policy goals. The goals could be in the area of healthcare, it could be education, or other priorities that at that time the government deems to be important. Now, there are three main areas that governments will engage in to influence fiscal policy or policy positions. It could be through borrowing money, it could be through taxation powers that they have, and it also is through their operating budget, their budgetary priorities in any given year, how they spend money. And through those three mechanisms, they'll engage in fiscal policy to impact or influence the direction that they would like to take the economy and other general policy decisions that they have on the top of their priority list at any given time. Now, when you look at the various policy decisions, obviously their spending powers, how they spend their money in different areas, has an immediate and pretty direct impact on individuals and families and the economy. And then tax policy, as an example, has an indirect impact. It influences behavior. So the motivations that drive governments to use fiscal policy are often driven by the experience of economic growth, whether the economy is generating employment, whether the overall quality of life for people is being enhanced, or if the economy is going through an economic slowdown. So if things are slowing down and the government feels that the economy is not working to its full potential, then that's what might trigger some policy decisions. So again, it could be spending money. So it might be something as simple as let's do some project development. We'll get some money out there for highways or construction, and that might trigger some immediate employment. And let's say there's 1,000 jobs that get created. That money flows to those workers, the material costs, the construction that's going on, all has a direct economic spin-off. And then governments will also try to quantify, and this is much more difficult to quantify, the echo effects of that economic activity that's generated through fiscal policy or government spending. And the echo effects would be what's the impact of people who have those 1,000 jobs and spending money in their local communities. That obviously will potentially provide additional employment and economic growth and commerce in the communities being impacted by those projects. But that's very hard to quantify. It's generally felt that there is a positive ripple effect, but it's very difficult to sometimes get a clear sense as to what the real impact is when that money gets spent by governments. Sometimes there's some controversy around the government's role in fiscal policy. So sometimes there's the argument that if a government policy goes out and spends $10 million, that $10 million to generate economic activity might have been money that the private sector might have spent anyway, depending on the circumstances. So there's this tug and pull around, should government get involved? Are they just displacing private sector investment that might going into the economy? And could that money be better used in other areas like direct investment in healthcare or education? So fiscal policy is not just about direct spending, but then governments can also, through fiscal policy, decide that they want to use through the tax code rules, guidelines, regulations that would incent businesses to invest in certain areas to provide economic opportunity and growth within the economy. Now, even when the economy is doing well, there can be an argument for governments being engaged in fiscal policy. One example might be through just investing in better infrastructure. So if you've got economic growth taking place, then governments may use their powers of fiscal policy to provide better roads and infrastructure to help the economy produce and work more efficiently, which in the end leads to better overall growth in the economy that hopefully has overall effect on a larger amount of people within the country. So when it comes to fiscal policy, where does the government get their money from? Well, they could get their money from taxes, but the reality is that only goes so far. Most governments are in deficit situations. They don't take in enough money from tax revenues to look after all their fiscal priorities. Another example would be, well, maybe they run some surpluses, so they spend actually less money than what they're taking in. That very rarely happens. So in the end, a lot of these priorities get funded through debt. So the government goes to the debt markets and borrows money to fund these policy priorities. So governments obviously are going to rationalize this decision. Their view is we'll go out and we'll borrow money because we think the long-term benefits of making this kind of investment and then paying back that borrowed money over time are worth it. It seems to be a trend that's been going on for many, many decades, but it certainly has accelerated the last decade or so. So one of the things that governments always have to be mindful of when they pursue fiscal policy, and particularly when they use debt, is something called the debt to GDP ratio. So how much debt do they have outstanding relative to the size of their economy? So I'm just going to cover off a few stats for you to kind of underscore this point. So if we go back to 2016, a few years ago, the debt to GDP ratio in Canada was 31%, and that was according to the 2016 federal budget. Other G7 economies or countries at that time had an average of more than 80% debt to GDP. So when it comes to using debt at a very practical level, we all get that for the most part. So if you bought a house, you probably took out a mortgage, you thought that was a good use of debt, so it provided shelter, lifestyle for your family, and it was also an asset that would appreciate hopefully over time. And governments are making the same trade-off decisions. Can we invest in infrastructure and services that will increase the overall quality of life for people, but also the overall capacity, productivity, and economic growth for the country, right? So those are important calculations, and the use of debt can make sense in many circumstances. The problem is, just like with families, if governments take on too much debt, it has a negative ripple effect. This is why fiscal policy is important for all of us to understand, because if we sleepwalk through it, turn the channel, we're not interested, then we all of a sudden are in a situation where, politicians have made decisions, governments are voted in, they're voted out, deficits are initiated, money is spent, and then 10 years later, we're in a pickle. So the chart that I'm going to show you takes a look at total general government debt to GDP. So you can see here the blue columns. Back in 2018, we were sitting at a total debt to GDP of 88%. And if we go to 2019, we were at 87%. And of course, when we went to 2020, 2021, we're looking at 117% debt to GDP. Now, there were some one-time events that took place that led to extraordinary borrowing to get through COVID and government shutdowns of the economy. But the other line here that's really important is looking at interest costs for governments in the country. And you can see the forecasts are for dramatically increased interest costs over time. Now, why that's important is that's money now that's going to be going to debt servicing. From a policy standpoint, the money was spent, that's now gone, but now we're left with the legacy of the spending. And that money now is money that's not going to go to healthcare and education. And so whenever we make policy decisions, we really have to lean into those policy decisions and understand what will the ripple effect be for the citizens, for our country, when we take on this much debt. And so I'm not saying it's right or wrong necessarily, but I do think that a lot of people sleepwalk through the policy decisions and they don't really wrestle with the implications as much. And I think sometimes politicians hope that's the case, right? That the average person's not wrestling with the trade-off between, just like with families, at some point, will this debt have a negative impact on our pocketbook? So how do governments cope with this? Well, they cope with it by increasing taxes, reducing program spending. Those are direct impacts to families. You will have less money in your pocket to do the things that you want to do. You have less access to services. This is why fiscal policy, number one, understanding it, and then paying attention to the debate around fiscal policy decisions and what different political parties stand for in terms of how they would make those policy decisions is really, really important. It's not necessarily right or wrong. If you're okay with taking on this much debt because you thought that the policy decisions were the right ones and increasing interest costs over time are just the price we have to pay, so be it. But it's really important that we pay attention to the debate. So when it comes to fiscal policy and specifically around deficit spending, the question always is going to be, I think, is deficit spending a good idea? Well, it depends. And there's two camps, and then there's gradations between the two. There's people who are hawkish on deficit spending and people that are dovish. If you're hawkish, you basically believe that, number one, governments don't have any business intervening in the economy. That's a role of corporations, private sector commerce, and that money will get invested in areas where there can be a return and it's productive use of capital. And over time, that's the best decision. And secondarily, that when governments take on debt, they have not exhibited a lot of discipline around paying down that debt and managing their fiscal house. So the argument is, don't go down that path. Governments always kick the deficit and debt reduction question down the road, and they push it to future generations to deal with. Let's stop doing that. That would be the hawkish perspective. The dovish perspective is, we think that governments do need to intervene from time to time. Maybe COVID is an example, although I think that there's a generally recognized perspective today now looking back that maybe there was too much intervention, particularly in the latter part of 2020 and certainly through 2021. But anyway, that'll be a decision to unpack for future generations about whether it was the right policy or not. But in saying that, when economies go through depressive states or they slow down, someone who's dovish on deficits would say that's when governments should intervene. They should use the tools they have to support the economy so that the economic dislocation because of downturns in the economy aren't too painful. And then during good times, they can use their increased revenues, tax revenues, that kind of thing, to make adjustments to their fiscal house. So again, I think it's a complicated discussion, but it's clear that governments have exhibited very poor discipline in terms of managing their fiscal situations, incurring large debts and large interest costs, which, based on the chart that I showed you, could have some really negative impacts on government program spending. As more and more money goes towards servicing our debt, there'll be less and less money there to fund healthcare, education. Healthcare particularly is an important one because we have a country where there's an aging demographic, and there's no doubt that healthcare costs overall will keep going up. Well, that concludes my comments on fiscal policy, a really important part of economics and certainly has a very practical impact on all of us. It impacts how much money we have to spend at the end of the day after we've paid for taxes. It impacts what kind of programs are available from governments in terms of access to services. And so if we are blind to the policy decisions being made, it could have a real negative impact, not just to us, but also our kids and their future children. So the next time you hear the word fiscal policy, don't tune it out. Get engaged. Understand what the debate is and lean into it. And if you think it's going to have an impact, then see if you can take action to influence some of the policies you think would be more appropriate for governments to pursue. Anyway, I hope that you found the video helpful. If you don't want to miss future content, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And as well, if you are beginning to look at your retirement, maybe you're already retired and you just want to make sure you're tracking in the right direction, there's a link to our website so you can access information about our retirement income planning service. We'd be pleased to engage you in a conversation in that area. Anyway, wishing you all the best in your retirement and overall wealth planning. You take care.